You're listening to the Perth Property Show, Australia's only weekly property podcast by West Australian experts for West Australian listeners. Catch your latest episode every Monday at 7 a.m.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Perth Property Show. My name's Trent Fleskens, your host as always, and this week is another suburb update. It's one that we've been covering for, I guess, the last 3 months now, is a real push on going to our experts on the ground across the state to get a real understanding of how things have been moving over the last couple of years. Some of the suburbs we've been looking at, we haven't updated for a good 4 or 5 years now. And Dianella being one of the largest suburbs in our state with over 24,000 people in the suburb. It really comes up with Canning Vale and Baldivis, and Byford is one of the biggest in the metro area, is one that I think is a good barometer for where things are going in Perth, and a very varied suburb as well, given the massive demographic changes between the different pockets. Now, there's one person I want to speak to with regards to Dianella, and it's Daniella Sparta from Professionals TWT. Daniella, thanks so much for coming in.
Thanks for having me.
Now, there's a ring to it in my head straight away. Daniella from Dianella, is that a thing?
It is a thing. So for the last 20 years, how it started is every time I met someone with an accent or English was their second language, they just called me Dianella. And I went with it for years and years. And then one day I said, I am Daniella from Dianella. I've grown up in Dianella. I've invested my first homes in Dianella. My children go to the school in Dianella. Everything I do is in Dianella. So I am Daniella from Dianella. And that's how it came about.
Own it, right?
Yeah, that's it.
It's a precarious time in property because there's a lot of noise right now. A year ago, we were talking about elections and tariffs, and there seemed to be noise affecting the transaction at that point. But in this week, in the middle of May 2026, it's now war on the other side of the world, affecting fuel prices and affecting interest rates and budget time and all those things that have people having a conversation around the dinner table and the barbecue as to whether they're buying, they're selling, they're investing, they're subdividing, with a little more trepidation than most. The stock on market is slowly ticking up, but it's still below 5,000 properties on the market, which is essentially a third of a balanced market. We're still transacting on a good 800 properties a week in general, and so demand is still there. But it's a good chance to be able to get more data on the ground in a suburb like Dianella, because Dianella is really an everyman suburb, isn't it? It's a meeting ground for a lot of people.
It is, because you've got the units, you've got the huge houses, but then you've also got developments as well.
It's a massive suburb, and we've spoken about Dianella in the past with regards to how the different pockets are so varied. But for those who might not have listened over 250 episodes ago to our first conversation on the podcast about Dianella, it's one that has 4 pockets really, isn't it?
It is. So you've got the area where it's all the dream homes, then you've got the middle range, and then it goes smaller into units, flats and apartments.
Now, when we think about breaking it up into that segment, it's pretty geographically split too, isn't it? Those beautiful homes are up in the north, Mirrabooka sort of space, isn't it? And then you've got your Bedford pocket and your Morley pocket.
Yeah.
And then your Flatlands, Morley Drive sort of part, don't you?
Yeah, so you've got St Andrews Estate, which is the exclusive part. However, Dress Circle, which is across Urigan Drive, is the older houses with bigger plots of land, and they still hold their value really well. So you're talking still for a really old, rundown, large home. I sold one for $1,950,000. So it's still very expensive considering it's so much older than the side of St Andrews.
Yeah, and we talk about St Andrews, we're talking about multi-million-dollar mansions there, aren't we? Stuff
Correct,
that would
yeah.
cost millions to replace.
Yeah, there was one that has just cracked the 3 million in that estate, which is the first one, and that to build, you'd be looking at 2.7 just to build.
So you're below replacement value when you factor in the land, obviously.
Very much.
These homes, most of them, 20, 25 years old now. Do a lot of them need a reno?
Look, they're still in really good condition because a lot of them have been built from the beginning, but getting to that point where the wet areas are starting to look a little bit dated, including my own house. So my own house was built really well, but it's now getting to that tipping point where we need to decide whether we're going to renovate the wet areas or keep going.
When we think about segments again, it's generally been a suburb that does service those with a bit more money than most, but also first home buyers as well. As you referenced, there's units and some newer apartments near the shops. The shops is another conversation when we think about the investment that needs to go into that.
Yeah.
But what's the cheapest thing we could probably buy these days in Dianella?
I've just sold a 2x1 duplex that was fairly run down. That one sold for $886,000. But then this week in a complex of villas, I sold a small 3x1 for $850,000. And that had strata levies as well. The rental yield on that wasn't so great, which is why the price was a little bit lower. But if you think about $850,000 for a really small place in a complex, it's still quite up there.
Especially when you consider the options around it. There are a number of options in Bedford and Morley as well to go with. Obviously, people still keen to pay for the suburb name in a lot of ways.
But Dianella has always been that really nice suburb. Even back in the day, 20 years ago, when I was solely doing property management, when you did a rental home open, you always had a good calibre of tenants to choose from. The minute you stepped out of Dianella and you went to a cheaper suburb that was really on that border, the quality of tenant also dropped as well as the price.
When you think about your weekends at the moment and how they compare to maybe the start of the year, I'd love to get some feedback from you in the same way that we have a number of top agents over the last few weeks on the numbers. How many people are coming into your home opens right now? What questions are they asking and how many offers are you getting compared to maybe February?
Yeah, so funny you say that because the numbers are actually still strong. So 2 weeks ago, I had 39 groups through, but the number of offers is less. So I ended up only getting 3 offers on that property. It was a small 4x2 fully renovated. That still sold for 1.75 cash offer. However, if you were to look at a few months ago, you were getting more offers.
So one thing we've been postulating on this podcast about probably for a couple of months now is where that's coming from. Obviously, we know there's noise. We know affordability is becoming a factor. But is it the case you think that same property at 1.6, 1.5 would have had the 10 offers, but it's now getting to a point at 1.75 where we're thinning the herd? The demand's still there, but the accessibility to actually afford it is starting to thin who actually can put an offer in.
And that's exactly what's happened. So even when you go across the Dianella, where on the Naranda-Morley border I had one, and that one there had 47 groups through over the couple of days, and I was thinking, oh my God, this is going to go for much higher than expected. It only ended up going for 1.26, and normally I would have thought out of those numbers you'd get a lot more, and I only ever had 3 offers on that. Normally I would have at least had 6-7 offers.
But if you were putting that on the market a year ago, what do you think that number would have been? You said 1.26 now.
Yeah, that one, I guess back then around, it would have been about $1 million.
Yeah.
And what's happened is a lot of people, their budget and coming to my home opens are saying, look, I can only afford up to 1.5. So then it's almost getting to the point that Dianella is no longer affordable for them.
So again, it's thinning the herd. The demand base is still there. There's still the amount of people, because people don't go to home opens just for fun, going there because they would like to buy a home or an investment property. So it feels like from the data we're collecting here, there is still a large base of people who need to buy, who need a roof over their head, or who'd like to use their equity to buy an investment property or upsize or whatever it is that their goals are. The demand base is still there. However, the seller expectation pushing the market to a precipice of affordability. Now, that doesn't mean the roller coaster just falls off the edge. The way that I look at it is it probably just starts to dampen the outcomes of this dynamic, in that price growth still happens, but it probably comes with a lot more friction. It starts to slow down in terms of the growth itself, but the growth still exists because there are more buyers than there are sellers.
Correct, yeah. But what else is happening is the sellers in Dianella are starting to get to the point where they're almost wanting too much for their homes.
This is becoming the issue.
Yeah, and buyers are actually saying to me, this isn't worth that. This is all the work that I need to put in. This is what my renovation cost is going to be. So it's really trying to find that balance.
Markets ebb and flow, and when you look over the course of 12 months, nothing really ever works in a straight line. You look at a 12-month growth period, is probably only 4 or 5 of those months that actually had the real growth, and the rest of it was ebbs and flows. It feels like we're entering another one of those breather moments where sellers probably need a bit of a tap on the shoulder to say, hey, this is the new price point, but pushing it further is unrealistic.
Yeah.
And buyers probably need to take a second to think about, hey, can I afford this, for one, in a raising rate environment? But 2, I still need a roof over my head, so at some point I'm going to have to pull the trigger on something. It feels like we're in that precipice at the moment. Do you get that feeling, or something different?
I do, but what I'm also getting is I'm getting families that they have one child, they want to have their second, and they're living in these really small 3x1 duplexes and things like that in Dianella in a really nice spot, and they're coming to the 4x2, and what they want to pay, they actually can't afford it. And so then they're saying to me, oh, if my offer is too low, then I'll just do a renovation on my place. And I'm saying on your 300 to 400 square meters, even doing that renovation, it's still going to be tight. I ended up having one, when they got it costed, they ended up buying through me instead of doing that full reno, because I said to them, this is your cash out now price. You go and do that reno. Are you going to get that extra that you're putting into it? So it didn't make sense. So then they ended up buying a property from me in Dianella that was on the cheaper side, and now they're going to sell that and have less mortgage than what they would have.
Yeah, so solutions are having to be thought about at the moment to fix what is an untenable situation for a lot of people, but one that isn't changing. The dynamics aren't just going to flip because buyers want them to. I think we're probably just going to enter a bit of a loggerhead period. Whilst there is noise on the other side of the world, whilst there is a questionable interest rate forecast for those looking to get a loan or needing a loan, I think what we're going to see is a period of stagnation for the next 6 months at least. Whilst price growth doesn't happen materially, it also certainly doesn't go backwards, given the fact there are still so many buyers trying to not only battle with the seller but with their bank to affect the transaction. Why are people selling at the moment? Are they cashing in?
Dianella's a really old suburb. In fact, I've grown up in Dianella, so I've lived there my whole life. So that's 40 years. And a lot of those people are actually still in these huge homes that are hitting their 85th to 90th birthday, and they're needing to make those decisions on whether to downsize or even go into aged care. A lot of those houses as well, they're not able to maintain those huge beautiful gardens anymore as well, and it's becoming expensive. So I'm finding those owners are having to sell, and there's going to be a lot more of those as well.
So there's a changing of the guard is what you're saying?
Yeah. Young families trying to get in because the school's really good. It's a very family orientated area, but a lot of those houses are still taken up by that older generation.
Our median house price has now ticked up into the $1.2 million space after 22% growth last year, which is outperforming the Perth market in Dianella. Is that growth coming from a uniformed shift in prices across the board, or do you think a lot of it's come from the bottom end being squeezed up to the top because of things like the 5% scheme?
So I remember at the time there was a 2x1, and I was one of the first agents in Dianella to crack the 700, and that was a huge price for a villa. That all happened when that 5% scheme happened, but also it was the over east investors being able to get a really good yield from the Dianella area as well, and that started to push the prices up, but so did that scheme.
Are we seeing the same growth in the $1.5 to $2.5 million space? Is it possible? And the reason I ask is because I would have thought most people in that price point are probably looking somewhere closer to the city, somewhere closer to the ocean if you're going to be shelling out that sort of money.
It's also family roots as well. A lot of people have grown up in the area. They now have their own family. They still want to live close to family. So to give you an idea, a lot of my family, we're all streets away from each other. And a lot of my friends that grew up in the area, they are also. So if your mum lives close, then you do too, and so does your brother and your sister.
It's a very ethnic suburb, Dianella, isn't it?
It is. And if you want dinner on the table, then it helps to be close to mum.
Yeah, actually, qualitative side is something that I've not heard on this podcast before, but it's so true. And there's a stat that I've repeated a number of times over the last 8 years in this podcast, and that's that somewhere around the 90% of people end up living when they get to adulthood within 5 Ks of where they grew up.
Absolutely. It's everything they know.
Yeah, and it's where your friends, obviously your family live, and for the most part, that's what it makes us happy, is those things too, right? So you put a good line in the sand there, because whilst I'm thinking people will just generally be aspirational about moving towards the western suburbs in those price points, there's still a lot to offer when it comes to the family unit in places like Dianella.
Absolutely. When I first met my husband, he wanted to move closer to the coast and he couldn't see the allure of Dianella, but now that he's lived there for so long, he understands it. So everything we want and need is close by, but it also comes down to the school drop-off. You go and do a school drop-off, and in my daughter's class, there's a girl that I went to school with, and now her daughter is in the same class as my daughter. When I went to take my daughter for the first day of year 1, I walked into that classroom and that was my year 1 classroom. So it was such deja vu, but there's a lot of that. And Dianella keeps a lot of the people in there for that reason.
In order to be getting more people into the suburb, you need to be providing more supply. A lot of that has come from house behind a house subdivision, and that has been, I think, the most part of development over the last 30, 40 years. Is there much left of it? Is there still much of it happening?
The thing with Dianella is a lot of the good parts and the expensive parts, there are 20, so that doesn't allow that. But what is about to happen is they have finally going to put through subdivision on Dianella Drive, the Channel 7, Channel 10 area that's been bushland and kangaroos for all this time. And finally that's going to be sold off. So that's going to be really interesting because people will now be buying a block instead of an old house to renovate.
And big money, I assume that will be. And there'll probably be some great views coming out of there.
There will be, but it's such huge land that you'll be able to get the blocks with the good view, but also smaller plots in the flatter part.
Well, when you say things like that and we juxtapose that against the comments you made earlier about these massive homes, I'm thinking straight away that these are going to be downsizer options. A lot of people in Dianella who are in their downsizing phase or would like to be probably don't have a lot of options of newer, nicer, smaller products because, as you said, there's not really a lot of opportunity in the R40, R30 space. There's not any real new nursing homes popping up. And for those who are still able to be living independently, this development, which although will be expensive, I'm thinking straight away, that's where your $2.5 million mansion owners going into their 60s are probably going to go and buy the smaller townhouse.
Funny you say that. I went and did an appraisal the other day and that's exactly what he said. He said, I'm not selling now, he said, but I will be selling as soon as I can buy one of those blocks because I still need to live in the area. It's all that I know, but I can't have this big house anymore.
And then everyone shuffles through that continuum. The people in the 3x1, they eventually make that move to the mansion. And then the first home buyer backfills in out of home into 3x1.
Yeah.
That's one of the great things about Dianella is it does have a lot of options across that continuum. And I think the one thing it has been missing is that next step, not the final step, but the next step for those people who have spent the last 40 years in Dianella Heights and St Andrews.
Yeah.
Without leaving the suburb. Have you heard anything on the radar about what's happening in Dianella Plaza? It was Kerry Stokes' first ever development, those listening, back in the 60s. It seems like it's had better days.
So Dianella Plaza has got so much potential and there's so much land, but walking into Dianella Plaza, every time I go there, I run into my mother-in-law or I run into my sister-in-law, and it really is just such a basic shopping centre. It's known for its good fruit and veg, and the Coles and the Woolies is there that is good as well, and the bakery, but it really could be something so much more special than that. So what's happening is when you want something else, people from Dianella are either going to Mirrabooka shops or they're going to Naranda.
Both of which aren't the best shopping complexes either.
No. A lot of Dianella residents complain, did you hear about when I went to Mirrabooka the other day and the crime and the riffraff that goes on there? So then that's the only thing that people aren't happy about. And funny enough, I had a buyer the other day say that she was from Sydney. They were trying to buy in Dianella. And she said, I went and looked at the shopping centres and they were a real letdown.
Even the option of the Galleria isn't really an option anymore either.
No.
Talking about buyers, what would your breakdown of buyers be right now if you had 100 phone calls on the next $1.2 million?
So
how many of those 100 would be local versus East Coast, first home buyers versus investors versus downsizers and upsizers?
So in that price range, I had one that was from 1.3. It had a lovely backyard 3x1, and most of the people that came through were couples that are either looking to get married and have a child or married, so they were living in places like Mount Lawley and Innaloo, but wanting to come and live in Dianella. So the people that actually bought it, they were living in Morley in a rear 3x2, very small place. They wanted a yard to have birthday parties for their first order.
So this is the real family forever home move.
Yeah, absolutely.
And locals mainly? Do you have many calls out of 100 from the East Coast?
Not a lot. Only the ones that are coming back who have gone to live over east for work and things like that. What I have sold in the last 12 months a lot of is the smaller places to over east investors that want to rent them out because the yields have been really good. So they pay $700,000, they would get a $700 a week rent back then.
If you got 10 offers on a property, how many of those would be cash versus finance?
One cash, if that.
And has that changed in the last year?
Not really. Their terms are strong, so pre-approved and all of that, but very rare they cash. The only time I've had cash offers is the over east investors that are buying smaller stuff.
Yeah, because they're probably using equity. That would be 100% covering all that. And of the last 100 sales you've made, how many have had finance problems? I know we like to do our due diligence as much as possible, but we can't be across it all.
Yeah. So I've actually only had one that fell over and it was not legitimate. And the reason I say that is because I'd done all my due diligence. They were a professional couple with no children. I went and appraised their property so I knew what theirs was worth. They were going to do a bridging loan and it all went well. I checked, they were all pre-approved. Everything stacked up from what I could see. And then all of a sudden I got a finance decline letter. However, the day after, their property in Dutch went up for sale on realestate.com. Now, you can't get a finance decline letter and get your house on market on realestate.com. That would need photos and planning in that. So that
Change
was
their mind, obviously.
So I was going to say, that was the only one that I had that fell over and it wasn't legitimate.
Yeah, and that is the reality of finance clauses these days. They're nothing really. It's very easy to pull out of them with the new joint form of conditions a few years ago. It certainly isn't the case these days where it's really, as an agent, even worth following up on a finance decline.
I didn't bother. So that same day, I showed buyer number 2 through again. And as soon as the termination was done, the next day I had it sold to somebody else.
Final question we always ask everyone when it comes to our suburb spotlights. What's your favourite street in your suburb?
My favourite street would have to be Sycamore and Shannon Road. So the day that I buy in one of those streets, I've made it.
Why? What makes them so special? Where are they for people driving past?
So Dianella Heights is, for me, the pinnacle of Dianella. It has got the highest points and the views from up there are incredible. If you wanted to get there, you would either turn in from Dianella Drive and go to Oliver Street, Glanton Way, and then go up, or you could go from Alexander Drive, turning into Maybach and going round into it that way.
And if you had all the money in the world and you wanted to buy in Dianella, would it still be on Sycamore or would there be another street?
No, it would still be there and I would do a massive reno.
Well, it sounds like the houses are ripe for them. Daniella Sparta, thanks so much for coming in and sharing your suburb, Dianella. Really appreciate your time.
No worries, thank you.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the Perth Property Show. If you've only just joined the conversation, you can catch up by heading over to our website, perthpropertyshow.com.au, subscribing to the podcast, or joining our Facebook page. Don't forget to tune in next Monday at 7 a.m. for more expert insights, local analysis, and suburb spotlights. Happy hunting!